Welcome, everybody. Tim Spiker, really glad to have you on the show. You've got some unique perspective on what leaders need to do. And I'm really excited that we're going to talk about that. Would you please let our audience know a little bit about your background and what you're doing today?
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate the chance to be here. It was about 20 years ago when I was waiting tables in St. Louis, Missouri, in the U.S. for any international listeners you might have. And I had a colleague who invited me to an open house for a marketing company. And, at that stage of life, my graduate studies were going to be focused on marketing. I also was pretty sure that there was going to be a free meal there. And as I was in a time of life, that was really important. So I said yes. And so I went to the meeting and I took a seat in the middle of the room because I figured there'd be some type of presentation, and there was. And that turned out to be a very fateful decision because about 3 minutes into the presentation, I figured out what an open house for a marketing company actually is. It is actually a recruiting meeting for a multi-level marketing company. That's what it actually was. I tell people and I don't have anything against those types of organizations, by the way. I wasn't interested in selling water purifiers to my family and friends, which is what they wanted us to do. But at that moment, because I'd sat in the middle of the room, I was trapped. So I could either make a scene or I could just wait it out until the break. And so I decided to wait it out until the break. But that's when this really amazing thing happened to me. They started talking about what does it mean to be an employee. And I mean, it was like the dark cloud of doom and gloom entered the room from the back. And there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it was an awful scene for everybody. But I was just struck in that moment. And I just thought, it doesn't have to be that way. How come somebody doesn't ask you, what is it like to follow so-and-so? And your answer isn't, it's the greatest blessing of my life. You can't believe how much better I am because this person's leading me, or how much more we've accomplished because this person is leading me, or how this person invests in me. And I checked out. The rest of the meeting was like Charlie Brown's teacher. I didn't hear any of the rest. I didn't hear another word, but I just sat there kind of transfixed on that idea. I didn't have any answers, but it was a switch that got flipped in me. So
Tim, were you a happy employee at that stage? Did you enjoy your work, or did you not enjoy it?
I was still pretty, so early in life at that point. I think I was late 20s, and I was waiting tables because I was ready to start grad school. So I wasn't I was full of hope and optimism and promise, but I wasn't in the job that I was going to be long term. So not necessarily, but it didn't. I wasn't there. Keep in mind, I wasn't there because I wasn't looking for a new job. I was looking for a meal and some marketing learning. I thought it would be really interesting to learn from a marketing standpoint. So I waited for the break, and I grabbed a sandwich and I headed out the door. But that launched me, and the next day I started calling on leaders I knew, say, will you spend some time with me? I have some questions about leadership. And I had some very underdeveloped ideas of my own that I was bouncing off of people. But every time I met with somebody, I finished the discussion the exact same way. I just said, who else do you think I should talk to? And people were so gracious. They'd give me 2 or 3 names, and I'd call up Sally, and I'd say, Sally, I know you don't know me, but Bill Smith said that I should give you a call, and would you have some time to talk with me about leadership? And I can't remember a single person that said no. And that launched me on the journey that's brought me to what we do today, where I am just ultra passionate about leadership, what it can possibly do and create in organizations and in our lives personally. And that was the moment that sent me on that journey.
That's interesting, because it seems like if somebody actually turned you down when you called, like Sally, maybe they're not somebody you want to talk to anyway.
Well, you can make that argument. You can surely make that argument. I mean, I think the combination of, I know the person who sent you, and I do think there's a little bit of acknowledgments of somebody's expertise if you want to go to them to talk about leadership. And I think the combination of those things, and frankly, just people being gracious. To your point, if they're way too busy for anybody else, there's maybe a leadership question there.
Yes. Yeah. So what are you doing now? That was a while ago, and you've been on this journey. So
So I've worked in a boutique consulting firm in their leadership and organizational development practice. Then I did what many consultants do: is you end up getting hired on by one of your clients, and they say, "Hey, we want full-time leadership development in the organization," and that took us forward about 15 years. And then one day I realized that I was really passionate about some things about leadership that I had come to see both in research and anecdotally with everybody that I was around. And it was just tough to go at those things directly, either in a consulting firm or even within an organization with all the politics and perspectives that are there. And so we took the leap. So, I had three young kids at the time.
Can we pause?
Yeah, sure.
Can we pause there for a moment?
Yeah.
So you gave this very broad term that you were doing leadership development.
Yes.
Can you break that down? Maybe it changed over those 15 years where you started in one place, moved to another. What did that look like, and where were kind of the wins and struggles that maybe I'm not looking to chastise your former firm.
No.
But just can you give us a little more detail there, because I think there's some power in the journey.
Yeah, sure. So the firm that I worked for, we would take people up to the west side of Pikes Peak in Colorado for a week at a time. And we had a series of assessments and activities that we would put them through in order to help them kind of look in the mirror from a leadership perspective. Then we would also go into organizations, and there's a variety of things that land under the banner of leadership. Some of them really were leadership. Other of them were more like cultural initiatives that they wanted help with, just kind of depended on the client that we were working with. Oftentimes, we were in an organization that maybe had 3/4 of their strategy for developing leaders built out, but they felt like there was something they needed to add. And so they would look to us to come into their organization and work with the same individuals. Maybe you're with them every month or every quarter, something to that effect, as you're working through a curriculum. And then, of course, there's the one-on-one coaching aspect of leadership, where occasionally you get the opportunities to be knee to knee with somebody for a year or two or three as they go on their own journey. So all of those things fell under that umbrella in the consulting practice. And then internally, well, that's scary. So when you move from being a consultant to being internal, all of a sudden you're like, wow, all the things I didn't realize when I was consulting to this place. And
then you really get to know people.
Yeah, you do. And I would say sometimes that's scary bad, sometimes that's scary good. I mean, it can go either way. But essentially, take those same ideas that were happening in a consulting environment, and now you're there day to day, but you're still thinking about the whole of the organization. What activities, what practices can we do to move the overall leadership quotient of the organization up? And also, I had some responsibilities around the cultural development of the organization. So that's kind of encompasses those two stops on my journey.
Interesting. So when you were doing this work for the company internally, and you had kind of this awakening, what were some of the kind of the big aha moments?
Yeah, well, there's one really big one that led me to exiting all of those employers and starting something of my own, but I don't really think of it mine. I think of bringing it to the people that need it. So I'll tell you about that one because it really overshadows all the other ones. When I was at the consulting firm, we had data on those folks that came up and spent a week at a time with us in a variety of assessments. And we would commonly get this question, what's the magic mix? What's the formula? Show me a personality type plus specific natural abilities that equal a better leader or a better chance of having a better leader. And we had enough data to run those numbers. So my colleague, Vanessa Kiley, she took the SPSS software and put it through its paces. And we said, okay, now what were the results? And she said, nothing. There were no correlations at all. So there was no statistical connection between personality type and leadership effectiveness, natural abilities and leadership effectiveness, or a combination of those things in any aspect of leadership effectiveness. And I remember that night in her office. It was later in the evening. I was getting ready to leave. She said, but we did find something that we weren't looking for. And I turned back around. I was like, okay. She said, we have 8 areas on our leadership assessment. And great thing about software is that it will look for stuff in places where you're not looking. And so it's just looking for any correlation it can find. And it said, hey, you've got 8 aspects of leadership that you're measuring. 2 of them are responsible for just under 70% of the variability in that assessment, which if it's 2 out of 8, it should be 25% if everything is equal. So what we found is a really heavy weighting was just 2 areas. 3 years later, Vanessa ran the data again with 10 times the data points, and that number went up to 77%. And so we were like, okay, what are we sitting on here? We weren't looking for this thing. And it wasn't until I left the firm and we understood it was significant, but we didn't understand what it was just yet. And I was literally sitting in my office one day at my at my new job 3 years later, when the lightning bolt kind of went off in the whole of me. I was looking at this model, thinking about that research, and I realized that the 2 aspects of leadership that were accounting for over 3/4 of the variability on that assessment were about who you are as a human being. And the other 6 things were about what you do as a leader. And in that moment, it was like, oh my goodness, 3/4 of leadership is about who you are, not what you do. And I just sat with that going, oh, I can't believe that we didn't see this before. And then when the numbers point you in a direction, you start to really test it out with people. And I just started asking people to talk about their leaders. And if you do, you can try this. Anybody can try this on their own. Ask somebody to tell you about the best leader they've ever followed, they've ever personally worked for, and listen to what they talk about. Almost always, they will talk about who that person was as a human being, as a person, almost always. And that's the anecdotal evidence that supports the research. So that's the big that landed with me back in 2007. And I've been working my way towards more and more work in that direction ever since.
And that's interesting. It reminds me of Charles Schultz was quoted as asking like 5 questions, who won the NBA championship 5 years ago? Who was the all-star in baseball 3 years ago, 5 years ago? He had all these questions and nobody knows the answers. Although these are the celebrities, the things that are promoted. And then he would ask 5 other questions or 7 other questions, whatever it was, like, who was a teacher who really poured their life into you? Who was someone who stood by you when everybody else abandoned you? Whatever those questions were. But it all came back to a similar thing, who the person was, what their character was. And it strikes me that so much, particularly in our universities, we seem to teach in America either a particular skill or a political belief rather than building up character, which, although there were some flaws in what our founding families, I like to call it founding families rather than founding fathers. Founding families did, their intentions were good. And they really felt that this nation would thrive or dive into despair based on the character of its people. But it's interesting, that's what your research seemed to validate.
Yeah, well, part of the story that I really love is that we weren't looking for that. We didn't go into it with that hypothesis and say, let's see if this is true. We were looking for something completely different. But like I said, the software is going to do what it does. It's going to look for those correlations even when you aren't. And I feel so blessed to have been in the room in the midst of the group when that reality was put on the table in terms of data. And then there's been other sources over the years. HBR a few years back published an article that was based out of a consulting firm in Minneapolis named KRW that showed the statistical relationship between how well developed leadership and leadership teams are from a WHO standpoint. They didn't use that language, of course, but from the WHO standpoint, and financial returns. And then Human Synergistic, who has worked around the globe for many decades, they have a couple million data points that point in the same direction. And so getting a chance to, with the folks with Human Synergistics, I've got a chance to personally interact with them and talk through their data. And we've all used slightly different terms because we weren't coordinating what we were doing. But all of that data and information, and this is cross-cultural. This is not a North American or even an American thing. I've had the opportunity to work around the world in different places. I've been in Asia and have people say, yeah, this is my experience as well. And Human Synergistics data shows that as well. So it started out with one research project that I got a chance to be a part of. but I've watched many, many other organizations who have brought both anecdotes and research that support it as well.
Well, please talk to me about this concept of who we are, because we're talking a business environment.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, who we are starts when we're in a family. And our experience is part of that family. And then we reach a stage where teenage years, we break off on our own type of thing more. And then particularly in our 20s. And then whether there are opportunities, intentional or unintentional, for us to further develop who we are, remember, that may be changing unintentionally.
Yeah.
And I don't want to go a different side road here that you want to go, but talk to me, what do we do as leaders? And by the way, I believe everybody's a leader in an organization. I don't care what their title is. But what do we do as leaders to foster an environment where that's a positive thing that happens versus a negative?
Well, I think the first step is being open to it. And that's one of the things I find, because you start to talk about this concept of the who, not what principle. And there are some leaders who just like, look, that flies in the face of my education. That flies in the face of everything that I've ever focused on. And so I can't engage with it. But I've really had some fun experiences with leaders who would say those first two things, that flies in the face of my education and it goes against what I've invested my career in, but I'm open. Let's keep talking. And it's been fun to watch them over time say, oh man, I see where this is true, and to really come to buy in. So I think the first part is to be open. You don't even need to agree with it when you first hear it. The question is, would you be willing to take a look at the research? Would you be willing to take a look at what's possible? So I think that's the first step that can open the door to a lot of other possibilities. Are we open to talking about these kind of things?
All right. Well, so I'm kind of a type A, high D, if you're familiar with the DISC behavioral style.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's great. I'm open. Now, where do we go with that? Where's something I do with that? It's interesting. We do Dave's Charm School, which is soft skills training. And two of the courses that I've interacted with leaders on that they like is the one we do on character and one on empathy.
Okay.
Because it's not trained to a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, you're digging in the same hole we are. I mean, that's exactly where we are. So we have two big buckets where we look at who. I mean, some people, I love it when people say, well, what do you mean by who? Because that's the right question. Because what does that mean? Well, we talk about being inwardly sound and others focused. Those were those two areas that were driving all of that variability in the original research that we did. Inwardly sound and others focused. And then we break.
So did you say inwardly sound?
Inwardly sound.
What does that mean? So describe that for our people.
So we talk about people who are secure and settled in who they are. You're talking about being comfortable in your own skin. We could probably do an entire podcast on insecure leaders, and it would be painful, right? I mean, that would be like, let me get the Tums out, and we're going to talk about insecure leaders for an hour, and then I'm going to need to go take a shower afterwards because it's going to be awful. So secure and settled, self-aware, principled, holistically healthy, and purposeful. Like those are the things that we talk about. What does it mean to be inwardly sound? Do you want to dive in there, or do you want to talk about other smoke?
Well, I don't know, because like yourself is like a whole nother podcast. I mean, one of the problems we have in this country right now is intentionally or unintentionally, consciously or unconsciously, the media and many of our leaders have developed a very self-centered, narcissistic type of society. I like to say there's three common values in America today. Number one, it's all about me. Number two, it's not my fault. And number three, it's not my problem, so I don't have to do anything about it. So, I've developed three other values that I'd like to rally our country around, but once again, another podcast. But as leaders, here we face this environment, and what you're teaching, I think you go back hundreds or thousands of years.
Oh,
totally right on. Okay.
Yeah.
But you're speaking contrary to the habits that have been developed by many of the people we hire on our team. It's quite a challenge.
Yeah. Well, it's a huge challenge. And that's why, I'm, believe it or not, I'm an engineer by education. So that's a little bit shocking for some people to hear. But that really comes into play because I love numbers and I love logic. And so if somebody wants to say, I don't like the sound of that, my answer is, well, which part of it do you not like? Which part of it, actually, more importantly, which part of the research do you disagree with? And that's a great conversation to have. Like, I'm perfectly willing, and I don't mean that in a flippant way. Tell me what part of that doesn't seem to jive. And Jim Collins, who's written some amazing works, Built to Last, Good to Great, and all that. I love how Jim has responded in the past to people who didn't appreciate where his research pointed. And Jim was he's very kind and very measured about it, and said, look, you don't have to follow this path. You don't have to believe the research. You want to go and try something else and ignore this? Absolutely go ahead and do that. I'm just sharing with you what the research showed. And if I could just absolutely parrot that exact same thing back to folks who don't feel like maybe that I don't want to talk about this in business, or I don't want to talk about this at all. I don't, there's no reason for me to be mad about it. It's just like, this is just what the data showed, and I'm here to share it. And if that is something that feels like, I know we can't talk about that or acknowledge that, that's totally your call. But I'm going to continue to talk with people about it because that's what the research says.
It sounds like, first of all, as you mentioned, you got to get somebody who's open to talk about it.
Yeah.
But then if they're interested in talking about it, particularly if they're interested in acting upon it, this isn't like turning on a light bulb.
No.
This is like, okay, from now on, we're going to be people of good character. Boom. It's like change. This is a journey. This is time consuming potentially. Talk to me about the work you guys do, because it doesn't sound like it, take these 2 aspirin and in the morning, you're going to be a new person.
No, I mean, I appreciate your acknowledgement of that right up front. And it's totally true. Well, we take people on this thing that we use the word journey, that we call journeys, and they last between 1 and 4 years, depending upon a variety of circumstances in that organization. We're usually working with executive teams, but we're starting to move more into the space where we're going to have some things available to individuals who might want to be a part of it. And so this is a word, we did not pick the word journey by accident. And in fact, when we started doing this work, we didn't use the word journey, but we were trying to figure out, how do we articulate what this is? And so one afternoon with a client, I just said, I'm just going to try it. I started using the terminology journey and what we're doing. And honestly, within 10 seconds, they started using it more than I was, because we had articulated what they had been experiencing. And so what we do is we go through the 11 aspects of inwardly sound and others focused. I mentioned some of those with inwardly sound a moment ago. Others focused, we talk about being attentive, curious, empathic, humble, and a state of being called agapone. And then we also have a unit around being emotionally mature. And what we will do, if we have our druthers, and we don't always, sometimes there's organizations who are like, look, can you give us an understanding, but we're not quite ready for transformation. And so that can go a little faster. But what we like to do is spend 3 months on each one of those things, because we believe that true development, talking about at the core of who we are, we're working literally on who we are as human beings, because if we're more well-developed people, we're going to be more effective leaders. So when we try to do that, we try to bring 3 things in every single time: depth, community, and time. We believe that the time is necessary. What you're talking about, this is not a message that goes over well in corporate America. Like, I don't want you to tell me how long this is going to take, but we need time. We need time to simmer in these ideas. We like doing things on a quarterly basis because we believe that over the course of 90 days, leaders are going to experience the vast majority of their everyday leadership experiences over the course of 90 days. Unexpected good news, unexpected bad news, personnel issues, shifts in tactics and strategies, budget issues. If you take a week or two, you might be on vacation that week. Like, you miss the opportunity to simmer in these things. And over time, that's where we grow and develop as people. So depth, community, and time is what we try to have involved in every time we interact with a group. And that last part, the time, is not so popular, but I don't have magic pills or magic beans. And so working on who we are is a lifetime endeavor, really.
But those 90-day cycles are also consistent with Charles Duhigg's book, The Power of Habit, where he said 90 days to develop a habit. Now, there's been some other people Atomic Habits, great book. Also a follow up on that. He says, I think 66 days. I think 90 is a little bit more safe, but it sounds like you're also operating in that cycle. And it's interesting, if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that in those 90 days, you're going to be working on something, and then all these different business issues are going to be hitting where they get tested in it.
Exactly. So it was 2 years ago, I think, that HBR came out with an article about the problem with development is that it's too far removed from application. And the reality for what we're trying to do and what we invite people to do, they don't have to work with us to do this. So, they can do this in their own lives, is to use your everyday experiences as a laboratory. This is the place to try these things out. If you want to be a more effective leader, then practice while you're, go ahead and do it while you're leading. That's the lab. So we'll take 90 days, and let's take Curious just for example. We'll take 90 days and say, I am going to have a fixed focus on the concept of being a more curious leader for the next 90 days. Now that we have groups that develop what we call curious plans, and then they execute that during the time. And that sounds maybe complicated. Let me tell you how simple it can be. Let's say you and I are in a small group with a couple of other people, and we just look at each other and say, hey, in the next 90 days, we all commit to using the phrase, tell me more about that 100 times. I'm going to say, tell me more about that sincerely to other people. And by the way, it doesn't have to be at work. It needs to be because we're working on the whole person. So you want to do that with your spouse or your daughter or your son? Absolutely. And just watch what happens. Watch how many ideas that you learn about that you didn't know about before. And
do you actually encourage them to bring that home?
100%. I will tell you this. We have a quarterly thing that we call codification. And the idea is we're looking at a mosaic of the last 90 days. Step back from that mosaic. And what are the patterns that you see? Where was it really easy for you to be curious? Where was it really hard for you to be curious? And we ask them a number of questions to flesh that out. And so I will tell you, in that codification process, about a third of the stories that we receive are about things that happened at home. And so people really understand that this is not just a work thing. I mean, if you're a parent, goodness knows you're a leader. Like if somebody calls you mom or dad, hello. And so we love the stories from anywhere because we're working on the whole person. You might have a profound experience at home, but if it's helping you to become a more curious leader, then your curiosity as a person has elevated, and you're going to bring that into the workplace as well.
I'm reminded of reading, I study education a little bit and changing government policies and stuff just for fun. That's kind of odd, but I do it for fun.
That's your fun. Okay.
Yeah, but thinking about education, so when you run into someone who, for instance, at home they speak Spanish, or a different language, it's much more difficult for them to become proficient in English in the school environment because they're only getting it in the school environment. And then they spend their other time in an environment that doesn't have English at all, potentially. And so I really like the way that you're bringing it into the home and encouraging that engagement there. Now, it sounds like when you're working with companies, you're starting with the leadership. You're not like diving into everybody at one time. Is that correct?
That's how it's been. Now, one of the things, and this is things that we're excited about today, as we've had a chance to work with a number of senior executive teams, after a while, they're asking the question, how do we perpetuate this into the organization? How do we multiply? How do we scale? And we're in the process of figuring that out because, we didn't go into this. This is like the non-Silicon Valley model of scaling. Like we didn't decide we're going to spin this thing up. We're going to make it awesome. We're going to scale it. And then we're going to flip it. We just went into it saying, how do we help leaders be really great leaders? And so we've had to adapt over time. And it's very gratifying when the senior leadership team says, hey, I've got another 1,000 leaders. How do we get them, how do we get them exposure? And how do we do it at a price point that as an organization that we can afford? Because they're not going to invest the same amount of money and time at every level of the organization. So more and more, yes, we have started at the very top, but more and more, we're in the process of developing some more digitally based tools, but also with some support in there so that so that people can have the opportunity to engage at a variety of levels. So yes, a lot of our work to date has been the senior executive level, but we've dropped down into some other spaces as well, and we're constantly working now to figure out how to scale these messages so more people can have access.
Could we maybe start a ballot initiative where everybody who wanted to run for office had to go through your 4-year program before they could actually run for office? It would probably change the political environment, wouldn't it?
I would love that. I have a friend of mine, Steve Wilson, who is very active in the political space in Minnesota, and he has said the same thing. He wants every politician to have an opportunity. But you think about what's going on in the world today, especially with regard to social media, and this is one of my big concerns, because what we're talking about is about who's really at the core. And I fear that as a generation, I'm 48, so we didn't grow up with any of this stuff. But the concern now, and one I think that we want to lean into, and Tim Elmore and the folks at Growing Leaders who are working with high school and college age leaders, they're really into this in a big way, and they're awesome at it. But it's how do we help everybody understand the difference between who you are and your social media image? How do we help everybody understand the difference? Like, this is not a likes contest. This is not a retweet contest. This is about who are you really? And we really need to try to help people understand that whatever image that you have out there, that you're projecting out there, is secondary to who you really are. But that's a tougher and tougher message to deliver these days.
No, it definitely is. And I think complementing that is we really need to teach kids how to discern truth. They have this fantasy that anything that's in a video or that's written online is truth. And I'm not saying we need to teach them what to think potentially in that area.
Yeah.
But if we could teach them to discern what's factual, what's not factual, where's some historic reference that hasn't been altered, and that whole thing. Think about if we took your program, and you mentioned somebody who's doing some work in that area, which, by the way, I'd love to learn more. So please, after this podcast,
sure.
On that guy. But think about if starting maybe at 3rd and 4th grade, we could start to teach what you're talking about 3rd to 5th grade, reinforce it in middle school, maybe 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and then really bring it home in high school years.
Yeah.
It would transform our nation if we could teach people the benefits of good character and understanding themselves, and then how to discern truth and how to work together. I mean, the rest of it kind of just falls in. We'd be a totally different nation. Then we would be a nation that really led the world.
I agree, and that would be really different. Here's one of the amazing ironies of this research. When we talk about those two big ideas of being inwardly sound and others focused that make up 3/4 of your effectiveness as a leader, you don't actually have to have any followers to work on those two things. You can become a more inwardly sound person without followers. You can become a more others focused person without followers. Why not sow into those things before you're in a leadership position rather than trying to scramble to get it done afterwards? So it matches up exactly. What you're talking about. It's got to be one of the most ironic things that I've encountered in all of leadership, that the thing that accounts for the two things that account for 77% of it, you don't need leaders to work on, because those are the things that supercharge everything else that you do as a leader.
However, you brought something up that's really important that I'd like to emphasize, is that you're saying you don't need followers to be a leader. And there has been someone who stated, if you don't have any followers, you're not leading.
Well, you don't need followers to work on those things, is what I mean. You can work on those. That's what I mean. Yeah,
totally agree.
Have followers. Yeah.
But one of the 3 components of your plan that I'd like you to expand upon a little bit is you did talk about community.
Yes.
So you also, it's best, I would assume, not to work in isolation on this stuff.
It is.
But in community, what does that look like, working in community to develop this awareness and these skills?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to do community, but I'll share with you the way we do it. We take folks and we put them in groups of 4, roughly 3 or 4. And they are interacting with each other on a weekly basis. Hey, just a 15-minute to write email. Here's what I encountered. I'll go back to the curious example. Here's what I saw in myself this week. Here's how it worked or didn't work. We ask them to get together for a live conversation once a month. And then quarterly, we have a larger group session. The idea with community here, especially these traveling partners that are in your pod, if you want to call it that, is that number one, accountability. I mean, Matthew Kelly says there are a lot of things that make us unique as people. The need to be held accountable is not one of them. And I love that idea because I think, accountability is kind of the word that we all hate and everybody needs it. And so it's just like working out at the gym. If you're meeting up with somebody to do it together, there's a much greater chance that you're going to have success. Shirzad Shamin, if you're familiar with him, he talks about that the likelihood of follow through going up almost fivefold if you're doing things with other people. And so the first reason for community is accountability that helps us follow through. But there's more to it than that, because when I'm in community, I can get feedback on my development from other people who are up close to me. They can say to me, I might make what sounds like a crazy conclusion to somebody else. Well, you know what? I had a conversation with somebody where I was really curious and they got really upset. And so I'm never having any of those conversations again. And, somebody else might say, well, hold on a little bit. Hold on, just slow down a little bit. There was one person and the conversation didn't go perfectly. Do you really think that means that being curious is a bad idea? Like, we have people around us who can look at our missteps and say, hey, we're in this together. Can I share with you some observations? But the encouragement is just as important as well. Hey, that is an awesome story. You leaned hard into tell me more about that, and look at all the things you learned. So that learning from others happens when we're in community. And finally, we get a chance to learn from other people's stories as well. It's not just the feedback for ours, but I have heard so many times people say to me that along these journeys, as they do them together, they get a much better understanding of the core of what we're talking about by learning from the people that are in their small group with them. They get a chance to see their applications, and they're a little bit different than mine, but that's a different angle that I would have thought of, and I totally see the idea more robustly now. So for those three reasons, the accountability, the having somebody speak into my own developmental experience, and the getting a chance to observe others and learn from them, those are three huge wins and why community is so important on the journey. Yes.
So, Tim, you're opening up a whole nother conversation. So what I'd like to do is invite you back to another podcast.
Okay.
To talk just about this journey. And I'd like you to close this one out by letting people know where they can go to learn more about your organization and what you guys are doing. And then literally we're going to have another podcast soon I just want to talk through the journey. I don't know whether it'll take 15 minutes or another 40 minutes like we've done on this one, but there's a lot of meat there. And I think that people need to understand what that looks like, because I just finished Banning Leifshear's book, The 3 Mile Walk, this morning, quite frankly. And he talked about, as leaders, you get a vision, but it doesn't mean light bulb, you're there. You have to go through some downtime, sometimes some failures, sometimes, whatever, but there's a time lag. And I think that's what I'm hearing from you is that the journey is as important as the destination.
Yeah. I mean, these things, we use the analogy of a tree in all of our work, and that the who that we're talking about are the roots. So we see the great big tree and flowers and leaves and fruit, and it looks awesome, but it's what's happening underneath that's making it possible. And so we'll ask people, like, how long does it take to grow a great big, huge, awesome, strong tree? A long time. And so to be able to build into that is why we do the things that we do, and why it does take time. The place where people can find out a little bit more about us and what we do is theonlyleaders.com. The Only Leaders, which is a matchup. We just released a book on Amazon this week, actually, as we're recording it.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So The Only Leaders Worth Following. You can learn a little bit more about that, and we have some. As many places, we have some additional materials. If you're interested in being part of the email list, we've got some discussion guides and things like that. But theonlyleaders.com is where you can find us.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much, Tim. I'm sure our audience got a lot out of it. Look forward to our next conversation.
I am too. Thank you, David.